right, folks, welcome again to the Most Important Skill in Life podcast. I'm your host, Travis Daigle. This is episode 4, and today we're going to be covering the final principle, the third principle of personal ownership from my book, Adapt and Overcome: 3 Principles to Master the Most Important Skill in Life. Again, that's Adapt and Overcome: 3 Principles to Master the Most Important Skill in Life. Remember, in episode 2 and episode 3 of the podcast, we went over action over time in episode 2. Then we went over understand your story in episode 3. Now here in episode 4, we're going to be talking about maintaining a vision. Because remember, personal ownership is taking responsibility for our actions, our beliefs, our overall direction in life. The first principle correlates to actions. Second principle correlates to beliefs. And now this third principle correlates to direction in life. And so what do I mean when I say maintain a vision? And, the phrase I always use here is the process is more important than the products. So what am I talking about? When I say vision, I just mean a set of goals that you have for the future. And what I'm talking about here is that the goals themselves give us specific steps. That's why goals are important. Goals give us direction in life. They tell us what we're going to wake up and do tomorrow. That's why it's important to have them. It's very difficult, I think, to feel some sense of progress when you don't have a goal that you're aimed at. To feel like you're taking positive, to feel like you're taking healthy steps in your life when you haven't organize yourself in some direction by setting a goal for your future. So a vision is just simply a set of goals for the future. But the thing that I think about is sort of what characterizes a good vision. And I talk about 3 things. I talk about a vision being holistic, realistic, and bold. And so if we recap my situation from the last podcast, I was being evicted from my apartment. I was $60,000 in debt, barely making any money as a personal trainer. I just quit engineering after getting super depressed, et cetera, et cetera. And I found myself isolated in this apartment, barely making any money, being evicted, deep in debt, and wondering, how am I going to put my life back together? And for me, a good vision is what helped me get things reorganized and get my life back on track. And so when I was being evicted from my apartment, this was back in 2007. When I was being evicted, I remember thinking to myself, because remember, I had been an engineer making all this money, but that fell apart because I got super depressed and I ended up hating it. And so now I was trying to reorient my life in a different direction, but I needed to really ask myself what I wanted and needed, because the problem was being so deep in debt, I didn't have the time to really work as a personal trainer to try to develop my income as a trainer, which, side note, is a big reason why I try to talk to people about staying out of debt. When you're in debt, it reduces your options. I had creditors calling me all the time, demanding their money. My student loans were in deferment. I had credit card debt, so my credit score took a big hit at the time. And so, I'm very big on money management, because managing money well gives you the ability to control how you experiment with your time. And so I kind of forfeited my right to experiment with my time because I was deep in debt. So I had to figure out some very basic things. I knew I needed a job that was physically and mentally challenging, because one of the things I hated about engineering is it was just a kind of a mental job. Mental masturbation, if you will. Like, you're just like planning, scheduling, and then you're understanding theory. I was working in oil and gas at the time, and you're learning the theory of oil and gas, but you're not really, you certainly aren't using your body in a real way. So I wanted a physical and mental challenge, and I wanted to feel a sense of purpose and like service in the work that I was doing. I know engineers do lots of awesome things for our world and serve us in some incredible ways. That's very obvious. But I personally didn't feel that because I wasn't interested in the content. And then, of course, I also needed some money, man. I was in debt. Like, I got to get out of debt. And so I was sitting around, thinking about how I'm going to solve these problems. And this is where we get into this idea of being holistic, because I was starting to think holistically about my life. Now, what do I mean by a vision being holistic? When I say holistic, I mean that your goals, your set of goals for the future, your vision should take into account the totality of life. So, in a very practical way, what I lay out in the book is, in my life, I feel like I've seen four fundamental parts of life that seem to always pop up when people have problems slash when people are trying to change something. Now there certainly probably are more categories that you could add to this, but when I'm trying to, but remember, we're trying to get organized. Things have fallen apart in my life and I got to get organized. Now at the time, I didn't think of it in these four categories. I just fortunately just happened to lay out things this way. But here are the four categories. First, there's your health, okay? Then there's your personal finances. Then there are your relationships, and then there's work. And so ideally, when you set goals for the future, when you're lining up this new direction for your life, you would think about how does a goal in one area affect the other areas and vice versa. So for me, when I was sitting in that apartment, and I never thought this way with engineering, but when I was sitting in that apartment, I began to think about different things that I might pursue, like, or no, I'm sorry. When I was sitting in that apartment, I was getting calls from people close to me in my life, family, friends at the time. People were so caught up in the narrative of American dream and good job that no one ever suggested a different route to try. And I didn't necessarily think of these things back then, but like physically and mentally challenging, serving other people. There's firefighter, there's tradesperson, there's police officer, there is Secret Service, FBI. There are a lit paramedic. I could go on and on. There are a litany of jobs out there where, at the time I'm 23 years old. It's like 2007. There's a litany of jobs that could have served those purposes, but nobody suggested any alternatives. It was just like, go back to engineering. And so when I was thinking about what did I want and what did I need in my future, and I was trying to the key with the vision is you be honest with yourself. Be honest about what you want. At the time, it was 2007. We were in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I just thought to myself, being a medic on the battlefield would be a good way to be of service to other people. And oh, by the way, and I literally thought this way, as a medic, I would learn more about the human body, which makes sense for someone who is very interested in fitness. And so joining the military, obviously I would have a paycheck. And so that solves my money problems and I can start working on paying off debt. Obviously I got to be in good shape to be in the military. So getting healthy again, getting back in peak physical condition was attractive about the job. And, obviously a sense of purpose, being a medic on the battlefield. Like I said, I'd be serving people in a way that was much more tangible to me. Now, in terms of relationships, what I think the biggest thing I needed at the time was just to kind of isolate myself from people. And the reason I needed to isolate was, again, emotional blinders is a big theme in all these principles and when I'm talking through this time in my life. So a big part of what these principles are trying to do for us here is help us see through our difficult emotions. So I'm in this apartment by myself, and a big reason I'm isolating myself from other people is every time I talk to my friends, every time I talk to my family, people just keep bringing up that I just made such a stupid decision for leaving engineering. And what was so great about being in this apartment, getting evicted, and I'm not talking to friends and family anymore, I've decided to stop talking to them, is it gave me time to incubate my own self-confidence and self-worth and like hear and honor my own instincts and my own thoughts and have the confidence to go my own direction. And so ironically at this time, I didn't need, my goals with my relationships were really just to kind of silence everybody that I had known before and kind of step off alone into the unknown, because I felt like this would be a good direction for my life. And so when we talk about holistic, again, it's a holistic vision is a set of goals that attempts to account for the totality of life. And what I always try to do to help people with this is is think of four parts of your life. Think of your health, your physical health. And what I usually say is exercise and diet are the two levers you usually have the most control of there. Sleep, other things there, but just your general physical health. Think of your personal finances. For me, getting out of debt was big here. But like as I've gotten older, I'll talk about it more in the future. Budgeting, understanding your bills every month. It's paying off debt. Books that I'll recommend, etc. Think about your relationships. You got to think about, relationships is tough because you're talking about dealing with people you can't control other people. All you can do is control you. And so it can be touchy to figure out when it's time to create space from a person versus when it's time to try to draw closer to a person. Sometimes it can be a bit difficult, but again, future episodes will dig more into that. But relationships helps you kind of narrow your focus. Like if your stress or your problem is coming from relationships, or there's a positive direction you want to travel with your relationships, it gives you a way to like make this big thing called life a little bit less complex and bring it down to a focus. And then of course, the last one, another big one, is work. We spend 8 hours a day at work, sometimes, 40 hours a week, some of us 40, 50, 60 hours a week. If you hate your job like I hated engineering, like you got to be careful with that, because that's going to impact you. For me, if you listened to the other podcast, the previous podcast, I was suicidal when I was an engineer. Yeah, and I hated it. But caught up in a story, I was traveling down that road, which is why you got to be honest about what you actually want. Now, honesty does not mean whimsy, which leads me to the next characteristic of a good vision. A good vision is realistic. So when I thought about joining the military, eventually I went and saw an Army recruiter. And this recruiter, after learning some things, I had a degree, I'm into fitness. This recruiter was like, hey, have you ever thought about trying out for special forces? And I never considered that because I didn't think it was something you could do off the street. One, two, I didn't know how to swim. And so I was just like, there's no way I'm going to be able to do that for a litany of reasons here. But after talking with this recruiter, and we'll get more into the swimming part of it here in a moment. After talking with this recruiter, I went home and I started to research it. And what I realized is everything in me wanted to give this a try. Now, a big part of thinking about the military in general, and specifically thinking about special forces, what I knew was I'm signing up to go to war. This again, 2007. We were well into both Iraq and Afghanistan at this point, and the news was showing the reality of people dying every day overseas. So I knew what I was signing up for, and I spent a lot of time thinking about that. I mean, I thought about the worst case scenario, and what contrasted this with engineering, this line of thinking, again, being realistic is about acknowledging risk, or acknowledging the worst case scenario should you pursue a course of action related to your goals. So what I knew was signing up for the military and trying out for special forces meant that I was signing up to go to combat. And going to combat meant that I could be captured by the enemy, tortured to death, maimed, IED blast, any number of things that may not even necessarily, that could take my life, but if they didn't take my life, could severely disfigure me and change my experience of the world. And so I spent probably like 2 weeks contemplating heavily what this would mean for my life, and what could I do to mitigate this risk at the highest level. And so now, and for me with the military, that just meant taking my training seriously, trying to eat as well as I could, or as I understood at the time, making sure I'm in good physical condition, making sure I had a will before I deployed to Afghanistan, making sure I had talked to my parents about, what the potential realities were, et cetera, et cetera. I really just tried to expose myself to the worst case scenario mentally and emotionally. And then I tried to do some risk mitigation. Even trying out for special forces, part of my logic was, if I'm gonna go to the battlefield, why not go with the best in the business, right? And so, acknowledging risk is a big thing. Contrast that with engineering. I never thought about what if I hate my job as an engineer? I like when I was getting ready to go to college and then while I was in college, like I never even considered that reality of like, what if I hate this job so much that I want to take my own life because it's making me so miserable. I never considered when I got the car loan, it never dawned on me when I was getting the car loan after I started my job as an engineer, it never dawned on me like, Travis, what if you decide that you hate your job and you want to leave it, but now you have this 5 year car loan to take care of and you don't have an income anymore. And maybe you can't, and maybe whatever next job you get, you can't match the income you had as an engineer. I wouldn't make as much money as I made as an engineer until my final year in the military. That last year in the military, being deployed to Afghanistan, which makes your money income tax free, and being the highest rank I ever reached in the military, E6 staff sergeant, I think I finally made like $50,000 that year, and that's still I made $60,000 as an engineer. That still wasn't as much as I made as an engineer. So yeah, like I never thought about like when I was in engineering, I wasn't thinking about the worst case scenario. And what I've learned, and this fact continues to come up as I get older, is every course of action we take in life has risk. There is no risk zone. And so I think people have this idea in their head is that I think a big part of the reason why people were so insistent that I stay an engineer was they had this concept in their head that engineering is the risk-free American dream zone. Like it's the dream. There are no problems there. And that's just crazy, y'all. Like in hindsight, it's like that's ridiculous. Anything can happen at any point to any one of us that is detrimental, uh, to our health, or I could go outside, get hit by a car. COVID happened. People get COVID and pass away from respiratory illness or some other random disease. I mean, I was a Green Beret in the Army. Going overseas, you could contract any sorts of the number of times that I ate there were 3 times when I was overseas in Afghanistan. This is a sidetrack, but it relates. There were 3 times when I was overseas in Afghanistan that I ate the local food and I got, I forget what they call it. I want to say it's called gastroenteritis. But basically, in the year that I was deployed to Afghanistan, fortunately, there was months separating, but I would eat some local food, and then I'd have vomiting and diarrhea aggressively for like a week, and I'd like lose 20 pounds. Then I'd have to gain the weight back, and then we go out again, and we'd be trying to build rapport with somebody, and they'd offer us some food. I'd eat it, boom, go through it again. So like I did that 3 times in Afghanistan. That could kill somebody, right? And so there is no risk-free path in life. And what we would do better to do is say, okay, if you want to go a certain direction, let's try to anticipate the risk involved. Let's look at what we think might be the worst case scenarios and think about how we might mitigate those things. And let's accept that there are always going to be unknowns in the scenario. Okay, which kind of leads to my next point. But before I move on, again, emotional blinders. What people want, emotional blinders now, is people wanted me to stick with the herd mentality, right? And that's what I did initially. Everybody's going this way, so this way must be safe, right? Versus saying everybody's going this way. What are the risks associated with going this way? And does going this way truly align with who I am as a person? Because if it does align, then you take the risk and you move forward, right? Because principle number 1, if it's worth having, it's worth fighting for. Action over time. But again, all paths have risk, and then there's the unknown. And so moving into the final characteristic of a good vision, bold. And when I say bold, and I'm still trying to define this better, but there got to be things that where there's the potential for failure. Things that there should be some part of that vision that gives you some trepidation about whether or not you'll be able to achieve this thing or not. Because it's only through process is more important than the products. It's only through difficult, challenging processes in my opinion, that we truly are able, that we turn self-reflective, that it's only difficulty that really, it's not only difficulty, but difficult circumstances really really give us the opportunity and offer us the choice to turn inward and really examine our character and examine who we are. And so by pursuing bold, difficult goals, and we'll talk more about what this means, you really give yourself an opportunity to learn who you are. But and so okay, let's talk about what I mean by that specifically in this scenario of joining the military. When I was offered the chance to try out for special forces, like uh, I love saying this, I hadn't I had never been camping. I had never shot a gun. I'd never been on a hike even. Obviously, I'd never been a great athlete or anything like that. I didn't know how to swim. Okay, and in my head, I was thinking I was surprised that the recruiter offered me this opportunity, because I would have thought they would have like been screening for people who were like super smart, or which, yes, I was an engineer in college, but I wasn't super smart. I didn't graduate at the top of my class or anything like that. I didn't get like perfect scores on ACT, SATs, pretty average intelligence. I just work real hard. But I was also thinking, either exceptionally smart and or exceptionally physically fit. And I also didn't have any exceptions in that arena either. So I'm thinking like people who were former Division I athletes, or people who had worked for like NASA or something like that, who also happened to be pretty fit people or something like that. I'm thinking they would be looking for that type of person, and I didn't fit that model. But when I did my research and when I really spent time contemplating the risk and thinking about how this might change my future, everything in me wanted to try. My instincts were like, Travis, you need to try to do this. Like, I know there's a risk that you might fail, but you need to try to do this, Travis. And so I moved forward. And again, emotional blinders. Sometimes fear of losing, fear of failure can make us not try something that we really want to try. Also, sometimes fear of criticism and fear of judgment from others can cause us to keep moving down a path that we don't want to be on anymore, right? Like when I was an engineer, a lot of the issues that I had to navigate around self worth were, I lost the validation of other people, and that hurt for a while. Now I'm pursuing this other pathway that I really want to try, but it's intimidating, and there's risk for failure among the many risks associated with it. But I honestly want to try it out. And so what I've got to do is I've got to look past fear and anxiety and judgment, and I've got to ask myself, what do I honestly want? And I wanted to try this. And so I moved forward. Now, to kind of help us understand sort of the transformation that I went through, I'm going to tell you guys the story of not how I learned how to swim, but let me just go. The recruiter, when I told the recruiter that I couldn't swim, the recruiter told me something interesting. The recruiter told me that I would be taught how to swim in basic training, which seemed reasonable to me. But I didn't have any family members close to me that had served in the military, so I didn't have anybody that I could ask about what was coming. I just assumed that the recruit, like, why would they lie? Why would they lie and tell me that I'm going to sign a contract where swimming is definitely required? And why would they then tell me that, oh, they'll teach you how to swim, when I openly admit, hey, I don't know how to swim? Well, they lie because it's a tactic to get you to sign the contract. Because if I fail out of the special forces training, I would still go to an infantry unit or a combat unit. And at the time, they were struggling to fill all those ranks, whether it be infantry, special forces, whatever the case may be. They needed bodies. And so if they dangled a carrot in front of, a motivated, physically active young man, this carrot of, Do you really want to serve your country, son? Then you should go be a Green Beret. Well, and that was a magic trick to then get me to go be an infantryman somewhere if there was a risk that I might fail out. Either way, the recruiter gets a little bit of a bonus for getting me to sign a combat contract. And so I realized in basic training that the recruiter had just lied to me to get me to sign the contract. And I'm not saying that all military recruiters do this. This particular person that I dealt with did this. Now, here's the deal. Unlike with engineering and all this disappointment that I went through because engineering didn't work out, remember, I was dead set on doing this. Like, I wanted to try. And so when I got towards the end of basic training and realized that I wasn't going to be taught how to swim, I was like, okay, whatever. Like, I know that every military base has a pool there. I can either find local classes at the YMCA to teach me how to swim while I'm in the Q course. The Q course is a qualification course, the qualification course to become a Green Beret or a Special Forces soldier. So I can find YMCA classes, I can read books, I can look at YouTube videos, and I can just go get in the pool every day and try to figure it out. I also got buddies around me. While I was in basic training, I met people from all over the country. So there were some guys who had been to military academy. There was a guy there who had been a college swimmer. I could probably find somebody to help me figure it out. But once I graduated basic training, I ended up meeting somebody who helped me kind of move my confidence level to another level. And it's this guy, I call him Sergeant Smith because I want to protect his privacy. That's not his real name. But Sergeant Smith, he was a qualified combat diver in the military. And this means that he had been to dive school down in Key West, Florida, and he was as competent in the water as like a Navy SEAL. And so he was kind of like a liaison. At the time, I was at Fort Benning, Georgia, and then we were going to go up to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where all the Special Forces training took place. And he was like a liaison from the training pipeline. And he asked me, did I have any issues? And I told him, well, yeah, I don't know how to swim. And he was like, okay, meet me at this pool on base at Fort Benning, like the next day. And so I show up to the pool. I got a buddy with me who I went through basic training and airborne school with. He's just there for moral support. He had been a stud physically, and he had gone to military academy. He was going to the Ranger Regiment, and so like he was like somebody I would consider the ideal candidate for this kind of training. So he knew how to swim. He was physically a beast. Like he would crush the PT test every time we took it. PT is physical training, or is the physical fitness test in the military. And so he came with me just kind of as moral support. And so when I showed up, I show up ready to get in the pool, and I'm thinking we're just going to go over some basic swim technique. Well, Sergeant Smith shows up as well, but he's got his normal dress uniform on. And so it's very clear that he's not going to get in the pool. And so I'm wondering what we're going to do. And so he walks us into the pool area, and along the side of the pool by the deep end, there was this locker. And he walked up, it's this gray locker. I still remember the color. He walks up to the locker, opens the door, grabs out this blue brick that he pulls out. And before I can even say anything, he throws the brick into the deep end of the pool. And the deep end of the pool was 15 feet deep. And the deepest water I had ever been in my life at that point was like waist high, like an apartment pool, like an apartment complex pool. And in the book, I talk about like there was this time where I got pushed into a pool when I was little and almost drowned, came within inches of my life, whatever. So all that to say, I was terrified of the water, and growing up, because I was so overweight, I was real self-conscious having my shirt off. So I always avoided the water. And so I'm 24, 25, I'm 20, maybe 26 years old at the time, 25 or 26. And the deepest water I've ever been in is waist deep. Sergeant Smith just threw a brick into the pool. It's 15 feet deep, and my stomach like jumped up into my throat. And I'm like, in my head, I'm thinking, who does he think is going to get that brick? Well, he looked at me and he says, Travis, it would suck if that lifeguard over there, it was this young lady, maybe 19 or 20 years old, couldn't have weighed more than about 100 pounds. She was a lifeguard on duty. And he was like, it would suck if that young lady would have to get wet to go to the bottom of the pool to get this brick because you were too scared to go get it. And so he started pushing my buttons emotionally. And he just told me real simple, this is a water confidence exercise. So what I want you to do, and this is him explaining it to me. He says, what I want you to do, Travis, is I want you to dive into the pool with your hands clasped overhead like a spear, and you'll descend all the way down. You'll grab the brick, squat off the bottom of the pool, push up, and with the brick overhead, and you'll float right up, put the pool on the deck, and then we're done for the day. He said by basically he wanted to expose me kind of to the depth of my fear, and he wanted me to overcome it, and that would help me progress as I began learning how to swim. And so, like, man, my stomach was churning, man, like nausea. And I probably felt like I had to go to the bathroom. And anyway, whatever. So anyway, I turn away from him after he proposes this to me, and I kind of like said a little prayer. And then I started doing I started doing some risk calculation in my head. And what I reasoned was real simple. I had the lifeguard, I had Sergeant Smith, and I had my buddy who was going to Ranger Regiment, who knew how to swim, who was a physical stud. I had these three individuals there at the pool with me. If I dove in and something went wrong, between the three of them, they'd figure out a way to get me out of that pool. I was fairly confident in that. And then the next thing I thought about was, again, here's the power of story. This is when story goes right, y'all. I just thought about all the bullying and teasing I went through growing up. I thought about all the people calling me ungrateful when I quit that engineering job. And I mean, I just ran through different people's faces in my head through my history. And I was just, in the article, I say I had to reach down into my bag of trauma to overcome this obstacle. I was like finding that rage, and I was getting ready to use it to push past my fears, push past the emotional blinders, folks. And man, I turned around and I dove in the pool just like Sergeant Smith said. Went down to the bottom, grabbed the brick, came back up, put it on the deck. And when I got out of that pool, folks, like the sense of accomplishment that I felt was incredible. It was amazing. And the reason I tell that story is because at this point, I hadn't even been to selection. Selection is where you try out to see if they'll let you go to the 2-year qualification course to become a Green Beret. I just completed basic training, infantry basic training, and airborne school. So there was no Green Beret yet. I wasn't like deep into the training yet. This story about the pool is still my favorite, even over combat, everything. This is still my favorite story to tell about the military. And the reason it's my favorite story is I was terrified of the water. I was so scared, even more than combat. Man, shoot me. Like, I don't want to drown. I was terrified of the water. So to go into this, to dive into the 15-foot deep end of the pool when I had never been in water deeper than waist height at this point in my life, I'm deathly afraid of the water. It was a massive accomplishment. We all know, I hope we all know what it's like to overcome a big fear. And if you don't, hopefully stories like this will help you. But man, it was a huge turning point in how I looked at myself. It was a huge turning point. This is why bold goals are important, because they push you to your edges. This, by choosing to join the military and pursue special forces, and by choosing to accept Sergeant Smith's challenge that day, it pushed me past my fear to move forward in what I wanted to be and what I wanted to do with my life at the time. And it just changed the way I looked at myself. And it started making me think like maybe all the bullying and the teasing that I went through when I was growing up, like maybe there was some use in it, right? And you got to remember, the story I told myself as a kid is I'm going through all this trauma and struggle because one day it's going to be useful for something. And on that day at that pool, I'm 25 years old. It's like I began to understand my childhood and all the trauma involved in it in a new way, because that trauma and that pain and that anger helped me push past this obstacle. And so, that's my favorite story to tell, because it's just it was this moment of I had this intense fear. And up until this point, I didn't see myself as as the ideal candidate for special forces training. But after that, I realized that like I felt like, man, maybe I do have what it takes to do this. And even Sergeant Smith said, he was like, man, you're gonna be fine in the course, man. Like you're gonna be good because he later on he would tell me that he didn't know what he was gonna do with me. He just had no clue what he was gonna do with, and he literally made that exercise up that day. I ended up going through the medic course with him later on. And he was like, I made that up that on the spot that day. I didn't know what the hell I was going to do with you. How do you teach a grown ass man how to swim in 15 minutes, you know? And so like, but it, like he said, it was confidence. And that was a massive confidence boost to see myself do that thing. This is why bold goals are important. And I'm just taking a look at my notes here, folks. Look, y'all, ultimately in the military, I graduated in the top 20% of my class of Green Berets, made the commandant's list. You know, I deployed to combat for a year in Afghanistan. Fortunately came home whole and healthy. Paid off all that $60,000 of debt while I was in the military. And when I got out of the military, I had $60,000 cash in the bank. And so, like, man, and all those things were amazing outcomes. But again, going back to the story about the pool, the reason that story is so important is long before I ever got to any of those things, I began to see myself I began to rewrite my story. When I talk about understand your story, right? Because sometimes our actions come from our beliefs even when we don't know what we believe in. It's like I didn't know I was tough. Even though I had been through all these tough, difficult experiences in my life, until I got into the military, I never saw myself as a tough person. But it was those experiences and those situations. There were a lot of situations like the one with the pool. When I was in the military, there were a lot of situations where I had to overcome some challenge in front of me that I had never experienced before, whether it was parachuting out of planes, diving into a pool of water, diving into a river to do a river crossing, shooting guns, going to combat, preparing for combat, treating somebody that had just been shot, whatever. There were so many things I had to confront that I had never dealt with before. And by being pushed in that way, it forced me to learn who I am as a person, and it forced me to develop as a person in positive ways. It forced my character to evolve. And I think when I talk about pursuing a bold course of action and a realistic, holistic vision, a big piece of this, and this is why I say the process is more important than the products. You know, like I said, I paid off debt. I got my Green Beret, and those products were important. But the process of pursuing being a Green Beret helped me develop knowledge of myself. Like I really didn't know myself well when I was an engineer. I didn't really know who I was. And, you know, one of the biggest ironies of my time in the military is, you know, most people in the modern era, in the age of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, most people enter the service and leave the service with, you know, signs and symptoms of PTSD. And I want to be very clear here. You know, I only got in one major gunfight in Afghanistan. The other half of my team, not myself personally, got hit by an IED while we were there. Like, and this is over a year's worth of time. And so I don't know how I would feel about this had I been like, so I know guys who had to like fight every day when they were in Afghanistan and Iraq. In a year's time, we had one days long gunfight, and that was it. And nobody got hurt, fortunately. But that's all luck, y'all. But here's what I'm trying to get at. Here's the irony of my experience with the military. When I left the military and I came home from Afghanistan and when I got out of the service, I was a much calmer man than when I went in. And what I figured out was I had PTSD from my childhood. And when I was 24 getting ready to sign up for the service or any time before that, I wouldn't have been able to tell you that I had PTSD. But when I came out of the service and I started to recognize how much calmer I was what I realized is that the aggressiveness of the training and the really being able to embody these feelings of anger and rage that I had suppressed for so long, being able to pull those emotions up and use them in a positive way, like it was therapeutic for me, which is so ironic, right? Like, you know, you go, you grow up this timid, obese, bullied kid, right? And then you go into the military and you leave, and you go to combat and you leave calmer than when you, what you came in. It's such a crazy paradox. Not only like obese, timid kid becomes Green Beret, but then like obese, traumatized kid finds therapeutic relief in going to the military and going to combat. Like, it's so ironic, but it's that self-awareness that was so valuable about being in the military. And I will forever be grateful to my country and to the US Army and to a lot of the people that I met while I was in the service, because it was like I had this storm raging inside of me. And when I left the service, it's like the storm broke. It's like it just finally calmed down. And so, I mean, I think it's beautiful. I think it's a cool story to tell. I developed a lot as a man. But just kind of to conclude us here, and again, a big part of what you get from a vision is like knowledge of self, self-awareness, and just character development. But I think you got to have those three things: holistic, realistic, bold. You got to account for all parts of life, or try to anyway, because there's always the unknown. You got to be realistic, so you got to acknowledge the risks. Think about the worst case scenario by taking that course of action. And no, there are no zero risk situations. And then three, like, have the courage to push yourself, to push your limits. And when I say pushing your limits, it doesn't always have to be this big grand thing. It doesn't have to be being CEO of some big company, et cetera, or being a Green Beret or a Navy SEAL. It doesn't always have to be that. Right now, my biggest goals that are stretching me are, I'm trying to learn how to detach my self-worth from my job and my income. One. Two, I'm trying to learn how to be a better self-advocate. Because even after having done all these tough things in my life, military, most recently, I did an amateur MMA fight when I was 39 years old. Like, I still train martial arts on a regular basis. Like, even after having done all this stuff, I sometimes still struggle to advocate for myself. And it's a big thing that I'm trying to work on to make my relationships healthier. And, that this isn't some big grand thing, but it's pushing me. And I fail at it a lot. I go back, and you guys are going to hear this in the podcast all the time. I have been creating content for the last 11 years since I left the military. And in that time, I podcast, YouTube, blog articles, whatever the case may be. I'm just now figuring out what's a good pace for me to produce and what are good platforms for me. I mean, I've done public speaking, motivational speaking, et cetera, et cetera. I've done all these things for 11 years, and now I'm just now kind of figuring out what is a good rhythm and what are the right platforms for me just as a creator. And I don't know that it'll ever produce an income. I have put so much energy and effort into this, and I've barely seen any money out of it. And that's only for a few books that I've sold and the few events where I got paid to come speak and do a motivational speech. And that's only been a handful of events, maybe like 4 in the last 6 or 7 years. And of course, with podcasting and YouTube, I don't know that this will ever turn into anything from a financial standpoint, but I keep doing it because I believe it's worth it. If it's worth having, it's worth fighting for. And look, when I started creating content, something that I was not ready for, again, understand your story. I felt like I got this cool story. People are going to be open to hear it, especially my close friends. Man, not the case. Not all of my close friends at the time, but when I was living up in Tacoma, Washington, there were people in my friend group at that time. Not everyone, but there was a few key people who I had key close relationships with. what I didn't realize, y'all, is people are cynical. People are so cynical and jaded. People younger than me, I'm 42 years old, and just beat down by life. And so when you get somebody around you who you've known for a while and is just a normal flesh and blood person like you, who is trying to be encouraging, et cetera, et cetera. When you're a cynical, pessimistic person, that is what's the word? That's almost like toxic or caustic to your story and your perception of how the world works. And so I've battled adversity, just people mocking my content, people accusing me of being whimsical and a daydreamer, even though I think my ideas are very logical and reasonable. But again, that's just my perspective, right? Uh, and and also, I'll talk about this in a later episode. Just being laughed at for being a security guard. People, it's been my experience that there are lots of people who kind of look down on people who do security work, unfortunately. But again, I'm learning to detach my self-worth from my job title and income. I want to be somebody who tries to show up to work every day and treat my job seriously and try to be kind to people. I don't always succeed at that. It's a work in progress. But what am I saying about all this? I'm telling you that I'm still in the process and I'm still trying to use these three principles every single day, even beyond, it's super cool to tell the story of being the overweight kid who becomes a Green Beret. Look, it's cool, it's fun, but I think the deeper point is about controlling what you can control. It's about personal ownership and taking responsibility for our actions, beliefs, and our overall direction in life. And I'm still doing that, y'all. And I'm still very sober minded about what I'm doing. Yeah, like I didn't grow up wanting to be a security guard. And no, I don't know that content creation will ever produce a meaningful income for me. But I've been doing it for 11 years because I believe it's worth trying. I still believe that whether I get there or not, whether I get an income, whether I get to do this full time or not, it's still worth putting this message out there for, the one or the 1,000 people that it may impact in a positive way. And, along the way, I have to deal with the unforeseen expectations that I didn't realize I had, my broken narratives, my story that I need to update. And I have to keep, assessing my vision for the future, as I look at, as me and my wife talk about children, starting a family, as my parents age, do I need to think about getting another job with better benefits, better pay, et cetera, all these things, taking all these things into account, right? Holistic, realistic, but bold in the sense that like it's not easy to become, to make a life off of creating content. But again, if it's worth having, it's worth fighting for. Folks, that's principle number 3, the final principle from my book, Adapt and Overcome: 3 Principles to Master the Most Important Skill in Life. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Follow me on Spotify, follow the podcast on Spotify, and go to my website, travisdaigle.com, to subscribe to my blog where you'll get all the ideas ahead of time. And look, y'all, I believe in you. I believe if you focus on controlling what you can control, again, I break it down into 3 things: your actions, your beliefs, and your direction in life. I believe you can meet any challenge in this life with the confidence that you can adapt and overcome. And I feel like my life has shown me that I'm a normal person. I bleed, I gotta sleep, I gotta eat, I gotta go to the bathroom just like you do. I feel pain, I get my heart broken just like you do. But I have learned that I can do hard things, and I believe you can too. We'll see y'all next time.